Eugene, welcome to Dow Talk. Thanks so much for joining us. Heck yeah. So maybe you can just get us started by telling me a little bit about your background, kind of how you got into working in crypto Web3 DAOs, and then kind of lead from there into what you're working on now.
Yeah, sure. So my background overall, I did my undergrad in finance and psychology, and then I ended up jumping into the world of finance, though I was graduating in 2010 from undergrad, so just perfect timing to be getting into the finance industry. So I ended up joining a recruiting company, which is never what I thought I'd be doing. I ended up moving with them abroad for 2.5 years, which is kind of what kept me there for a while. And then I got to switch to a staffing/consulting company and spent about 3.5 years there as well. So total 7 years across the corporate experience. But I just very much could feel that it was not my vibe, but I did not yet know where my vibe was. And so it took a while to figure out I was able to get on the board of two nonprofits and work much more closely with some nonprofits. And that was rewarding in its own right. And I really enjoyed it, but it still wasn't fully giving me the sense of where I wanted to land. Back in 2014, I think it was, one of my family friends first recommended that I go to a startup weekend in New York. And that was my first real exposure into entrepreneurial ventures and more just startup thinking. And that was great and exciting in its own right, but still, that wasn't fully scratching all the itches I was looking for. Um, and then around late 2015, early 2016, I ended going down the veritable Bitcoin rabbit hole, which, quick shout out, that is a cool Bitcoin shirt. But going down the rabbit hole, and this is early or late 15, early 16. So this is slowly getting to the point where the DAO was about to happen. And so I was just kind of learning about the tech, a lot of late night, rabbit hole spirals down YouTube videos and the like, just catching up. And what the heck is all of this crazy stuff? And where did it come from? And how did it just seemed like it magically appeared out of nowhere. And I know things don't magically appear out of nowhere. That just means I was grossly ignorant of the entire background and context. So that went down a kind of a multi-year journey that really inspired me to go get my master's degree. But yeah, kind of the actual starting point was I started working with a couple of folks who are in the space now, with Ken Eng and Chris Lima and Michael Maloney, all who are doing really cool stuff in the space. And we all worked on a project together called EduDown, not the same one that came up like a year and a half or 2 years ago. That's more focused on academic university level funding. We were trying to focus on funding K through 12 schools and local nonprofits, specifically in the Bronx in New York, because we were all from New York. And we were trying to think, and I was on the board of a nonprofit in the Bronx, and we all had various connections there. And so we were trying to think, how can we actually create and use DAOs to help communities drive change in their communities, and not just come in and be like, hey, this is what you need change there, but it's more like, hey, how can we just bring in some cool tools that communities can then use to inspire change there? And it was a really exciting journey. It was an amazing kind of hands-on way to learn about DAOs in the space, but we were just way too early. I mean, there was no infrastructure yet. As soon as we actually talked to like a CFO or a council or anything along those lines, it'd be like, "Are you nuts? I'm not touching this stuff. We're not getting anywhere near this." So, yeah, I mean, everyone else kind of who worked on the project went off to do their own cool stuff in the space. I kind of dragged my feet. Similar story with my career of like, until I find something perfect, I'm just going to go with what I know a little more. So I went back to school, did my master's in public policy at Carnegie Mellon, stuck around there to help build some community around blockchain and around some research around blockchain, as well as some other domain areas, and launched a podcast there. And then, yeah, last year I found SCRF, which is where I finally made the jump full time into Web3, and have very much not been looking back since.
That's awesome. Yeah, the going down the rabbit hole thing is such a universal experience, I think. With people in crypto, you're like, wait, what is this? The next thing you know, you're like not getting as much sleep as you should be. Um,
And it's funny now, I feel like, especially depending on the pocket in crypto that you're in, it's like if you're in public goods or refi or region, like any of these spaces, like, oh, well, I had my green pill moment, not the rabbit hole moment. So it's just interesting how the verbiage is changing a little bit over time. But I feel like that same essence of, whoa, all of this exists and it's super relevant to my passions. And now I want to figure out what to do with all that.
yeah, for sure. I actually think, as a little bit of a side note as well, but it's really bullish for the space that people are going down the rabbit hole on slightly different things that are more relevant to their background. Because I think historically, you would have had to have some level of interest in like finance, money, economics, computer science, which is an admittedly broad set. But I think with a lot of these DAOs and kind of verticals of DAOs where you can contribute to, impact DAOs, or you can contribute to DeSci, or you contribute to this or that, people are kind of going down the rabbit hole, but in a way that's, I don't know, more actionable, which I think is a really good thing, because it's like diversifying, the contributor base for the space. So yeah, would love to dig into SCRF. Super exciting that you're in the space full time. You kind of like SCRF pilled me sort of in our first conversation. So I've been like reading the forums, trying to get ready to like jump in myself. But would love to hear more about what SCRF is, and what your role is, and what your vision for it going forward.
Yeah, for sure. I like the SCRF pill. We'll have to think of our own little pithy meme that we can do around that or something. But yeah, so SCRF, or Smart Contract Research Forum, for the full technical name. Then we prefer SCRF because that's just a silly word to say, and it's much shorter. But yeah, so Smart Contract Research Forum, the basic gist of the organization is we're grant funded org, so we're not monetizing anything that we do, and we're very much just focused on the public good angle around how do we facilitate knowledge between those kind of generating, especially theoretical knowledge, and those actively hands-on working in industry. So, I mean, if you go to any college campus in the world, or a research institute at least, and you tell your academics of like, hey, I'm doing something to connect industry and academia, they'll be like, sure, I've heard that thousands of times before. Like, how are you actually different? So from our perspective, we started with the forum, so Smart Contract Research Forum, right? I'm sure anyone who's listening to this and is in the space, you'll recognize that it's a instance of discourse, and we have this forum to house moderated long-term research conversation. So that was kind of the starting point of building this organization, was how can we actually elucidate relevant knowledge for folks in a way that kind of you don't have to dig through the full kind of 40 to 60 page latex documents, as Rich Brown, the co-founder and person who I'm working with very closely at SCRF, that he likes to use that kind of phrase, right? And it's a concrete example, and I know Rich and I went through a similar-ish experience, just given our timing was aligned with kind of just getting into the space, where you would have conversations in 2016 with a bunch of self-purported DAO enthusiasts, and you mentioned the word co-op, and there was a lot of questioning looks going around of, wait, what's a co-op? What's that? And it's, like, that's not great, right? If we're building something that is crudely can be boiled down to co-ops plus blockchains, you kind of should know what a co-op is. So, and right, there's all kinds of similar other examples depending on where people are specifically in the space, but there's just so much energy and enthusiasm coming into building anew that we want to help people recognize, hey, if you're focused on problem X, here's kind of a relevant landscape of knowledge that you should be aware of if you want to meaningfully affect change in that domain. And so I will be the first person to say we have not solved anything yet, right? The knowledge facilitation, getting the right knowledge to the right people, all of these are open questions for very, very long times. Like, these are not new to Web3, nor are we the first tackling them, right? And I'm sure we'll touch on the topic of DeSci, or decentralized science, right? It's very important to see how DeSci fits into the whole world of open science and, decades worth of activity, which themselves, right? Like, the first academic journals have been around since the mid to late 1600s. We're building, this is attempts at, changing systems that have been going on for centuries or millennia. These are not like, hey, a thing happened a year ago and we're just slightly tweaking it. So there are no clean solves and fixes here. So I see, right, our starting point was the forum itself, but I see kind of where we're trying to head in terms of really experimenting and thinking through what is that full landscape to understand how do we actually facilitate knowledge. And I know just a timely example that we were not involved in directly, but it was just a pleasure to be part of as a participant. But recently there was the GLF, the Global Governance Learning Forum. Sorry, there's too many acronyms and I always confuse them. But the event that Other Internet and Orca and like Jules and Toby and Kara and so many other folks between the two orgs put together. And it was an awesome event. And it's just so cool to see different groups focusing on how do we actually facilitate knowledge to the right people And right, what does that mean? What is the knowledge? Who decides which knowledge? Who can present that knowledge? What does it mean to facilitate? Like there's so many, you can really unpack every sentence there. And it's not just like a semantic, annoying philosophical discussion. It's actually important from the design aspect. So it's amazing to see all of these efforts. We've been collaborating specifically in the governance domain with DAO Research Collective and MetaGov to source open problem list. And, we're coordinating on getting a DAO workshop day on the back end of the Stanford conference, and trying to place master students or PhD students and support them with funding at different universities, and try to build more of these networks of governance researchers. And so that experimentation of the networks around research is just kind of one thread of what we're exploring. But yeah, I'll take a pause there.
That's super exciting. I definitely resonate with your comments around people are very enthusiastic to build the new, but sometimes we maybe don't have the opportunity or don't take the time to understand all of the relevant learning and work that has gone on prior to DAOs, in this instance. Like in the case of layer one blockchains and crypto economics broadly, right? It's like we we saw Luna go down, and it's like, oh wait, the laws of economics still apply, right? The laws of physics still apply. In the case of DAOs, the laws of bottoms up organization still apply, and everything we've learned there. So definitely, that's definitely, as someone who's more on like the practitioner side, building DAOs and contributing to DAOs and building tooling, like it's something I see a lot. People jumping into problems and not really knowing exactly where to start, and just so kind of doing. So I think the work that you're doing with SCRF and just all of the kind of networks of networks, and like this effort to connect practitioners with with researchers, to source new research that is like highly relevant and impactful to the DAO space is really important. So I would love to dig into a specific example. It could be one of the organizations you talked about, or just a specific research problem that you've been working on or just watching closely, and kind of dig into like what research is being done and then how practitioners in the space can connect to that research.
Yeah, and we're still quite in early days. So again, like we are still figuring out and trying to just do more experiments. So an immediate call to action for anyone who finds any of this interesting is please help us figure out other experiments, right? We do not pretend that we are doing the full suite of everything that could or should be done there. But to provide some more concrete examples, and I'll kind of take, say, governance versus cryptography as two separate research domains in the space that realistically have a very different version of how they roll out and get interacted with. So, let's take cryptography for a moment, where the majority of cryptographic primitives are very much academically driven. And right from the beginning of like PKI infrastructure being proposed by IBM researchers, and what was it, in the 60s with Diffie, I'm forgetting all their names right now. Anyway, sorry, my caffeine is not fully working at the moment. But nonetheless, right from the beginnings of it, there's a lot of reason why a topic such as cryptography needs a very theoretically, not just theoretically, but academically rooted support infrastructure. Because if you just use a bad cryptographic primitive and built a bunch of tech on it, all of that tech is then subject to fundamental issues. So having this slightly more drawn out, hyper rigorous model is very important. And it's really interesting to think about, say, governance as a contrast, or especially until DeFi summer 2020, governance was kind of an afterthought, and it was kind of a theoretical future problem. There wasn't as much live challenges happening with meaningful amount of capital behind them that people were willing to put in the same time and energy to think through how can all of this go wrong and what are the contingencies, in the same way that people are instantly horrified of like, whoa, this is a new cryptographic primitive. How do we know it's not going to get broken in 3 months? And then everything else is ruined as a result. And I mean, I don't, right? This is not like value judgment on one or the other. It's just the reality, at least how it's seen being rolled out. And I remember governance was always what interested me the most. And in 2016, even though the DAO happened and DAOs became a dirty word until kind of MakerDAO slowly started reframing that and making us feel that DAOs don't need to be these scary, dirty things. But anyway, it was interesting how going around to a lot of like crypto conferences and talking to people, governance is always like, that's a fourth, fifth order consideration. We got to solve the tech problems. We got to solve the tech problems. And then as soon as there's enough progress where billions of dollars are sat in contracts that need to be communally governed, all of a sudden governance jumps up to like a top three problem for everyone. And even so, a lot of governance is still heavily copy pasted. And I mean, again, that's not a judgment on governance side. Like you kind of look at cryptographic primitives and you're like, what is there enough research to say that we can safely use? Who else is doing that? Let's copy paste some of those ideas of how to use that as well. And so there's a whole challenge around what does safely experimenting and researching these topics even mean and look like. And another way to position that kind of thought is if anyone is familiar with Bell Labs and kind of the innovation that they did around communication in a variety of different ways, right? What does it mean to create more open versions of Bell Labs in those kind of highly innovative environments that go really deep on all of these domains, whether it's cryptography or whether it's governance, while still being within this larger network of knowledge so that people can come back to understand, well, how do changes in cryptographic primitives affect governance or affect another topic that's not immediately related on the pure math and research side of it. So I realize I kind of did not give the most concrete of example in answering this, but I think at least conceptually trying to think through how to support this research is itself a challenge. So concretely, what we're doing is we issue grants for people to summarize their research so that it comes on our forum so that people will hopefully find that research to be more approachable. Once it hits our forum, then we kind of have an engagement and moderation team that thinks through how do we maximize community conversation around this, and working with the outreach team and our discovery slash marketing team, kind of how can we both pull in other groups that are having relevant discussions and make sure that we're all coordinating on discussions together, and then tell the world that all of this is happening in the first place so that more people know to kind of come be part of these. It's a challenge, especially because, right, we're not just playing, say, a metrics game in terms of like, oh, we need a maximum amount of eyes or maximum amount of listens or maximum, just some kind of interaction metric, because that itself is not indicative of useful interaction with research, right? And is it better to have, a million people look at a page, but not all that much happens, but one person look at a page and they have a light bulb and go make a product that that actually affects the industry? And obviously, that's an absurd dichotomy. It's not just one or the other there, right? But it's what are the things we're actively trying to optimize around, and it's something that is fundamentally ephemeral, which is like functional facilitation. Right? How do we have things not just living in philosophy land or theory land, but how do we actually have things getting directly applied to, well, what does this mean for the things getting interacted with? So I still very much see that we are at the beginning of a very long journey. I can help, I can drill into some more concrete examples, but I still think we're still kind of laying out and experimenting with the fundamental aspects of what even needs to be present for this kind of facilitation to successfully take place.
Yeah, I love the comparison with cryptographic research because it's funny. Like, I actually have started to have that thought about governance. Like, when I see a new DAO that's ambitious and getting a lot of traction, I'm like, okay, so like, what research are we pulling on here? What like understanding of the depth of past experiences are we pulling on to make sure that this thing like doesn't rug to put it bluntly, right? So I think to your point, like as organizations like Maker and Compound, you know, Uniswap have attracted very material amounts of capital into their treasury, it becomes, maybe not as important as like what's underpinning Ethereum, but like pretty important, that there's like really sound theory and really like well, hammered out mechanism design behind this governance. So I love that comparison because I do think we're starting to get there. On SCRF too, like I love the idea of quality over quantity, you know, especially in crypto where the town square tends to be Twitter. I think it's really important to have a like a like a contrasting place where people can go, you know, deep and like really have thoughtful discussion, share resources. Like in the Ethereum world, right? Like it's like often the ETH research forums, but more at the core protocol level. But I think having these places where people can like really have those thoughtful conversations is really valuable. Like I said, I'm kind of like lurking in the in the forums right now, but I've already found it helpful to be like, okay, people are yelling about this thing on Twitter, right? But like this is where the actual work is being done to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, and that's when I know you mentioned ETH research specifically, which we see as an amazing resource for the space. And we actually, one of my own goals is figuring out how we can potentially collaborate with them or at least support each other, even if we're kind of hands off in any formal collaboration, right? But that's its own challenge is that right, right. We're all about incentives here in Web3, right? So if you think about the incentives of anyone looking at concrete problems, there's a lot of incentives to narrowly focus on very finite problems. And that is understandable, especially if there's any expectation of like, hey, right, we have a product launch in 6 months. I don't have 10 years to go into theory land and, chat indefinitely, right? Like we have a thing and our venture capitalists behind us are going to cut off our funding and then we don't exist. And so like right then you have these fundamental pressures and we can get into the role of venture capital in Web3 if we want to, but regardless, it's how do you actually create incentives for longer term research for these longer term explorations and right have room to kind of make basic innovations but in a way that is actually linked to what is realistically happening in the world. And that's where I think I don't know for folks listening if you've come across Ben Reinhardt's work on parpas or private arpas. So what is what if we take something like DARPA and try to build that model without the defense industry, right? What does it mean to swap out the defense industry in that analogy? What are we actually swapping out? Is it just a massive initial funding pool, or are there a lot of other things? And there are a lot of other things. And really understanding the full landscape of what even needs to be present from that kind of research infrastructure as a public good perspective, right? No one's really had incentive to build all of these things massively on an open scale for everyone. And I was actually just in a book club earlier today where we were talking about reinventing discovery and like all of this various learning that's been taking place, trying to assess various innovative environments or scientific breakthroughs or concrete topics and how they've evolved and what are the commonalities. And at least in my mind is like there are some things that we clearly know don't work, but we are still all collectively as a species trying to figure out what does it mean to maximize our ability to produce and leverage knowledge. Because like the goal at SCRF is not just to see, or we don't see let me rephrase, what we would like to see in the space is not just an increase in research, because right, as for anyone who's like very hands-on in DAOs, I'm sure you've had a lot more conversations in the last year of, hey, should we be learning from nonviolent communication and that whole world of kind of conflict resolution for how we actually apply that to DAOs and say for offboarding, right? Because all of a sudden, initially, all of this open onboarding and open community sound great until you got a core contributor that you realize is like creating a toxic environment for others, right? What does it mean to offboard a person in a very public organization where one person can't just pull them aside and be like, look, you're fired, you're gone, right? Like what happens when all of this is done through a DAO? And how do you create a healthy culture? And for me, like culture is one of the biggest things that is least understood how to change here. How do we actually create the culture that invites change?
We host a lot of like basically blog articles. Tally does from active DAO contributors, just kind of like sharing what they're seeing in the space right now. And this idea of like we're about to publish one today on burnout, and then like I've seen multiple articles recently about like this community side of things, really around safety, and creating a safe space for contributors. Like I think the community is really struggling with that, like of practitioners, and would absolutely benefit from bringing in some concepts that have been well established from other areas. A review of relevant research, maybe some new research. So I think that's actually a phenomenal example. Personally, I'm just seeing a lot of pain there, right now in the community. So yeah, I think that was like a really strong conversation. Hopefully, folks who are interested in research, which if you are a dower, which you probably are if you're listening to this podcast, you know, you should really go over to the Smart Contract Research Forum and check out a lot of the governance research and conversations that are happening there. I think it's a really valuable space. But if it's cool with you, Eugene, I want to transition to some closing questions. So the first one is a two-parter. So the first part is, what is your favorite part of working in DAOs, crypto, Web3 research? And then the second part is, what's your least favorite part or something you think we need to work on?
Yeah. So my favorite part is, yeah, I mean, the thing that really sort of why I tell people who are not in Web3 why I work in Web3 is that I am unaware of in history there being this much focused energy and capital investment in the research and building and tooling and all these various aspects of improving how we coordinate as human beings. And I remember a conversation that I had with Zach Anderson on a podcast, in the SCRF Interviews podcast, where he mentioned that so many of the feature requests that get a coordinate are to not have hard conversations. And so much of good governance, tooling, and research is pushing us in the direction of we just have to learn how to human better together. And for me, that goes down to really base levels of we must learn how to love and respect each other. And even if you don't like a person, you must still respect a person. And like these basic things that just seem like, fundamental building blocks of humaning. And going to the other side of that question is what is my least favorite part, right? Like every other space, we're full of hypocrisies. We don't see our own bullshit a lot of the time. Like we're full of it ourselves and not always catching that. And particularly for me, I think a big thing there is for the amount of times I hear people saying that, like, oh, we're fundamentally doing new stuff. And then in reality, it's literally building Web 2 on slightly different pipes. And I still think there's so much more room to deeply challenge some of the economic assumptions, some of the cultural assumptions, some of the ways that we bring people together. I really hope that more and more folks get excited to candidly push each other forward and call BS on, like, that's really not as innovative as you're pretending it is. It's been done 47 different times, and here's all the right. Like, let's not just be here to pat each other on the back. A healthy community is one that respectfully challenges each other consistently. And so that's where I'm really excited to hopefully be part of growing the amount of respectful, challenging, and hard conversations we have. Because I still think a lot of the space is just like patting itself on the back for existing and for adding wealth to a bunch of folks who might not have had wealth before. But then if that set of people then become the new ruling class over the next generation, how is that better? Like we fundamentally need to be challenging core assumptions. And I think too many of us are getting blindsided by short-term gains, whether from hodling or VC influence on the space or other things. I do think there's just much more of, like, let's start with the assumption that we are part of the problem, we are not the solution, and find enough evidence to bring us to the conclusion that we hopefully will be part of the solution. So yeah, that would be the big thing there. And also mental health, that's a big one too. Of like, this is hyper burnout culture, to the piece that you have dropping soon. So like hustle culture is great to a degree. We also need to recognize that like people need off time and we are not robots, and like being away from work and just being a human is a really good and healthy thing.
Love that. Love that. So last question for you is not crypto related, although it can be if you wanted to. And it's, what's your favorite place in the world and why?
I'd say what is definitely not, and that is overly large trade showy conferences. But in terms of what is a favorite place, so yeah, I'm going to take a few stabs at this because I'm just bad at favorites in general. So I mean, I feel like the question, at least on surface, implies physical or geographic space. So I'll start there. I mean, I've grown up, my family immigrated to the New York area when I was a kid. I'm just moving back to the New York area as we're recording. As far as if you like large, messy, dirty, filthy, active cities, New York is heaven. It is amazing. There's so much energy, right? There's funky odors in the summer, and there's all kinds of other issues ranging. Yeah, I mean, just the amount of like the rich killed New York graffiti that I'm seeing around this time, like strongly increased. And there's a lot of social and local problems that need to be deeply and meaningfully explored. but just like the energy and the diversity of New York is really unparalleled in a lot of places. So as far as urban environments, I absolutely love New York. And especially whether you're into Web3 or you're into mental health or you're into sports or birding or like whatever, there's a huge community in New York and it's just amazing to get to vibe. So, yeah, that I do really appreciate. In terms of nature, I am a huge fan. I absolutely love nature, and it is my recharge time to get out of a city and to get into the mountains and to ideally have some kind of long and strenuous hike followed by some lake swimming. So like I got to go to Lake Tahoe last summer and that was just pristine. It was just a magical place until the wildfires came in and we had to evacuate as a result of that. And the air was like 500 AQI and like unbreathable for a stretch. But yeah, just that kind of nature. And I know we both had a Colorado connection and, in the Rockies and like, I remember going to Great Sand Dunes National Park. It was absolutely stunning. Um, Otherwise, I mean, I don't actually spend that much time in virtual spaces or like social media or whatever. I try to unplug as soon as I can unplug from tech. Aside from geographic spaces, like I'm just going to plug reading fiction because I don't think enough people, especially who are engineers and computer scientists, spend in their own imagination and world that is not linked to a thing I want to build or a thing I want to learn. And learning how to appreciate the universes that others can help you build or inspire you to build, I think can be really important and powerful for the actual products or tools that we try to create, but also for just feeling like a balanced and enriched human being. And I know reading fiction is also a key balance in my own mental health and life journey, as is spending time in nature. So yeah, I'll plug those on favorite spaces as well.
We can see the diverse, varied interests of like your career background show up in your favorite places as well. Like
Yeah.
the the busiest, most stimulating city, nature, and reading fiction. I love it.
Yeah.
I
So you
love
need a
it.
balance of tensions, right, to be whole in the end.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Eugene, thanks so much for coming on Dow Talk. I think there's a lot of people who are contributors in the Dow space who will benefit from hearing this. Maybe taking a step back and thinking about, um, where can I plug in to research that's happening that helps move the space forward. So, really appreciate you coming on, and we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and I really appreciate being here. And yeah, please feel free to reach out to me if you are interested in anything we talked about. Always happy to get people more plugged into the research ecosystems we're aware of and part of.